Hello everyone, this is part 16 of What If Naruto Was Like the Sage of Six Paths, and I hope you guys enjoy this video and to like, to subscribe, to share, and check out the playlist, to see more comment down below. Now let's start the intro.
They call me a god. They call me a god. They call me a god.
Join my membership, the perks are great. It's in the description. 3 cloaked figures flickered into a small clearing, the slim crescent moon overhead barely illuminating their surroundings. It was only training and reflexes that allowed them to navigate the treacherous ground, especially with the hazy fog covering the ground around their feet. The leader of the trio held up a hand, halting them before they could step out of the tree line. Carefully he peered out through the mist, using his superior eyesight to scope out the path ahead for enemies or any other unwanted surprises. Finally, with a small nod, they proceeded on, swiftly vanishing from their spots in blurs of speed. When they reappeared to the civilian eye, they were stood outside of a small out-of-the-way building that looked to be barely standing. The various small, high-up windows were either broken or so clogged with dust and dirt they were practically opaque. The walls themselves were almost completely covered in vines and other parasitic plants that worked their way into every nook and cranny, weakening the concrete. Cracks mirrored the plants, winding around corners or just spreading out like black spider webs. After a moment of carefully observing the building, the leader of the group nodded again, the slight movement almost invisible in the darkened night. "Are we sure this is the place?" The leader of the group pulled back his hood, allowing his spiky blonde locks to fall about his face. He looked up at the building before them. It just had gloom written all over it, and the sooner they could be done with this mission the better. "It matches the intelligence we got." The second tallest of the group also pulled back her hood, revealing shoulder-length green tresses and half-lidded orange eyes that caught the weak moonlight. Although whether or not that makes it credible is debatable. The trio sighed at that even as the last member pulled down her hood, long purple hair flowing down her back like a waterfall. "Well, that's what we're here for, isn't it?" The leader just nodded with a grimace. This whole mission was just giving him a bad vibe, but somebody had to do it. "All right, follow my lead." With that he leapt up onto the roof of the building, his companions following shortly afterwards. The last 3 weeks for the rebellion hadn't been all that good. Despite their victory with the prison camp, they had begun to steadily lose ground. Their supply routes were being hit harder than ever, leaving many of their off-the-grid bases in dire need of support. Only when the help finally came they would only find a camp in ruins, the tents burned down and the rebels either missing or badly wounded. Most disturbingly, Naruto had noticed that only the supply runs that he took no part in were being ambushed these days, giving the loyalists a slight edge. It cost them both men and supplies, something the rebels really couldn't afford to lose. It spoke of a traitor amongst the rebels, somebody feeding Yagura information about their camp locations and supply movements while ensuring Naruto couldn't act against it. It was worrying because despite the investigation being done into it, no leads were being turned up. Right now all of the forces in the north were spread thin. With their front lines weakened by lack of food and weapons, the loyalists had slipped more than a few forces into their territory. Right now they were having to divert people away from the contested zones in order to protect their villages and towns. This in turn simply weakened their lines further, allowing more forces to slip through and continuing like this in a vicious cycle. Unless they could do something soon, or the spy was found, it didn't look too good for the rebellion. Right now Naruto, Fu and Shizuku had been sent out to investigate a report about an old supply cache that had been supposedly abandoned around the start of the rebellion. It was in a forgotten corner of Mizu no Kuni that was neither rebel nor loyalist territory. If the reports were accurate, then the supplies here would bolster both their front lines and morale, hopefully breaking them out of this dangerous downward spiral. Usually they would have a few more people backing them up, but they just didn't have the shinobi to spare. "All right, we go in, we split up and check everything, then meet back here, okay?" The two girls gave the monk a curt, professional nod before darting off. Before Shizuku could go too far though, she felt a hand tighten around her wrist. When she turned back she found herself looking into Naruto's glowing eyes. "Stay safe." He gave her a quick K which, when they finally parted, left the violet with a cute blush. She gave him a quick second nod before dashing off like Fu had, leaving Naruto on his own. Taking a moment to compose himself, the blonde looked around, his keen eyes quickly spotting what he was looking for, a small ventilation shaft poking out of the roof. He knew better than to walk through the front door of a supply depot, they tended to be quite explosively trapped. While Naruto could absorb the chakra from an exploding tag, the explosion itself was a different story. He trusted in his own abilities, but time in a temple had swiftly gotten any foolishness like overestimating himself out of his system. He quickly swung his body into the shaft, muffling his feet with chakra so that he only made the softest whisper as he touched down in the metal tube. Training in the use of silent K might seem strange for a monk, but the name was a misnomer. It was simply the skill to move without making a sound. K was optional. It was all in the positioning of your feet coupled with economical movement. Unfortunately, he wasn't allowed to know the true secret of the technique, a special form of chakra manipulation that insulated the body, but it was enough. Gently he removed a panel from the ventilation shaft, silently dropping down into a small darkened room filled almost to capacity by simple wooden crates. Rolling his L slightly from the cramped vents, he walked forward, shifting his back slightly to adjust his shakuju. During his time in the rebellion, he had taken to keeping it on his back, stuck there with chakra so it was easily accessible. It made things easier on covert mission like these. Curiously, he lifted the lid on one of the crates, surprised to find it stocked to the brim with K. When he did the same for another, he found it too was completely filled by shuriken, making his eyes widen in surprise. If every box in this room was the same, then it would be enough to keep a camp going for a month, and this was only one room of the building. He hoped Fu and Shizuku were having similar luck, but before he could assess any more of the crates, he heard scuffled footsteps outside the door. Acting on instinct, he silently jumped up to the ceiling, sticking there like a gecko and silencing his breathing. As the door cracked open, spilling light from the corridor, he held up a single-handed ram seal, quietly whispering to himself. Boidogakur no jutsu. Like he was never there in the first place, he suddenly vanished, only the briefest ripple in the air to show he had performed the technique. Beneath him a man walked in, his kiri headband immediately showing his allegiance to the loyalists. Naruto would have known if they were receiving backup. He only seemed to briefly look into the room, his eyes darting about between the crates before leaving again. With narrowed eyes, the young monk dropped from the ceiling with barely a whisper of noise. It seems we're not the only ones checking this place out. I just hope Fu and Shizuku realize that before they get noticed. Deciding to continue on anyway, Naruto quickly slipped out the door, still invisible to the senses. The corridor outside matched the rest of the building, drab and run down, cracks splintered across the walls and the roof looked like it was on its last legs. If Naruto didn't have to be there, he probably would have left in fear of the place just falling down around him. Stealthily he moved down the corridor, checking each room as he passed. Each time he found them completely full of those same crates. He could only guess that they were as equally stocked as the others. It made him wonder why a place like this got forgotten in the first place. However, his thoughts were short as he was forced to once again jump to the ceiling to avoid a patrol walking beneath him. Well, not completely forgotten it seems. He was slightly annoyed by that. The intelligence they had received told him the facility was completely abandoned. No loyalists had been seen in the area for months. He didn't think that this was a coincidence. He was just about to turn back and go looking for Fu and Shizuku when another patrol walked beneath him, completely ignorant to the fact he was listening into their conversation. Here, they already found one of them. Teiku thought it would have taken more time. They're supposed to be pretty good at sneaking around. Naruto raised an eyebrow at that, slowly following the pair down the corridor as he clung to the ceiling with chakra. I know, but I was surprised when it was just a girl. She was no older than my daughter. Rebels, don't they know when to draw a line? The blonde began to grow nervous as they talked. Looking up, he realized he couldn't follow them much further as they were about to pass through a door. True, but what can you expect from those bloodline freaks? They don't think like us real people. I'm just glad Yagura-sama. ... Naruto missed the rest as the door closed behind them. He had a frown firmly plastered on his face as he dropped to the floor. He really did not like the sound of that. Carefully he slunk back through the corridors, searching for any signs of his wayward teammates as he dodged more patrols. He wasn't worried about Fu. When the mint-haired girl wanted to be, she could completely blend in with her environment, like a camouflaged insect. No, it was Shizuku who Naruto couldn't help but worry over. While the girl had made leaps and bounds in her taijutsu and ninjutsu, stealth was still a relatively new concept to her. She had good senses though and knew when to stay out of trouble, but the problem was if she was already in trouble before she realized it. They had only recently started her in enhancing her eyes and ears with chakra. He just hoped that small lesson was enough. As he passed through another door, the faintest of clicks graced his chakra-heightened ears. Time almost seemed to slow to a crawl as he looked down and spotted the trailing end of the near-invisible wire he had just broken with the door. His muscles were already contracting to leap away as he brought his hand up, the chakra surging through his coils as he watched the small tag fall from the ceiling, one side already half engulfed in flame. The explosion, in such a confined space like the supply building, was deafening. His ears were ringing with various phantom pitches as he staggered back. His control slipped and his semi-translucent body suddenly became visible, blurry and indefinite but definitely noticeable. It was only by pure instinct that he managed to dive into a nearby room, one wall completely caved in by the blast, as a few shinobi suddenly rushed by. He lay there for a moment, his eyes wide and his breathing ragged as he waited for the perpetual ringing to stop. When it finally decreased to a dull monotonous whine, he could quite clearly hear the dull thumps of sandal-clad feet rushing by while he was safe for now surrounded by boxes. Dredging up what sense he could, the blonde shook his head, clearing out the last of the concussive blast's effects on his ears. He had been lucky to pull out a Shinra Tensei in time. The tag only had 2 seconds between being tripped and detonating. As he jumped up to the ceiling, he re-engaged his technique, rallying his control over his erratic chakra, still pulsating wildly after such a shock. It was just in time as not a moment later 2 shinobi raced into the room, carelessly knocking aside half-destroyed crates and sending K and shuriken skittering across the debris-ridden floor. It was only after a few anxious minutes of them poking at various crates did they finally leave, allowing Naruto to drop down to the ground again. Rolling his L slightly, he quickly dashed from the room. His control over the Boidogakure technique had grown to the point where he could move at a decent jog without losing focus. However, it unfortunately dampened his reaction times, what with his concentration being split 2 or more ways at once. He found that out the hard way when another shinobi emerged from a door just to Naruto's left, leaving the two to crash into one another, much to the Kirinin's surprise. Hey whatif, Naruto had already pressed his shakuju to the man's forehead before he could utter another syllable, but the damage was done. His trained ear picked up the sound of sandals suddenly turning on dust-covered floors, approaching him with a lot of haste. He raced from the room again, doing his best to control his erratic chakra but only partially succeeding. He hadn't realized how far he had managed to lose himself in the twisting hallways of the building until he found himself trying to escape, dodging shinobi like some kind of strange obstacle course. He was half a breath away from simply turning around and blasting everybody back when he finally found himself in a somewhat more open area that didn't seem to fit the scale of the building he had seen from outside. When he thought back though, he realized he had gone down a flight of stairs at some point, barely even registering it as he vaulted a young man with pale blue hair. He stood there a moment, glancing around the room quickly to find the nearest escape route. If you were looking for the exit, it was behind you. A loud clank sounded behind Naruto as the door he had just come through suddenly bolted shut from the other side. However, the blonde ignored that, instead looking towards the silhouette that had just separated itself from the shadows on the other side of the room. How interesting, I was sure it would be the other one I caught first. Fu was her name. Slowly Naruto pulled his shakuju off of his back. He was still invisible, but that didn't seem to stop the man from looking straight at him. Oh please boy, you can drop the jutsu, I know exactly where you are. I know where everything is within a mile of myself. Naruto stared still for a moment, barely even breathing before slowly shimmering into existence. The man wasn't bluffing. He could see his light pink eyes following the movement of his arm as he removed his shakuju perfectly, despite not being visible. He calmly walked further into the room, into a large area at the center illuminated by a large flood lamp overhead. I suppose you might be wondering how I knew where you were, or why you couldn't detect me before, or perhaps who I am. Ne. Naruto just kept his face impassive, his eyes narrowed slightly further than usual. I know who you are, Yagura. The man just chuckled softly as he too stepped into the light, an amused smile gracing his lips that didn't quite reach his cold, almost eyes. Ah, you took out half the fun. I had an entire monologue written out, but you had to go and ruin it. He laughed quietly to himself again as he moved further forward, his steps uncaring and almost jovial. I was always one for the theatrical, but I suppose you might have heard stories from your leader, Ne. Naruto stayed silent, bringing a greatly exaggerated pout to the young-looking man's face. Now don't be like that, I was expecting some rather pleasant conversation. It's not often I get to talk with a monk. They have a tendency to leave my country for some reason or another. As he spoke, a decidedly cruel glint entered his eyes for just a fleeting moment, but long enough for Naruto to catch it. Should I answer the questions that are so obviously tugging at your mind right now? Then again, I do love the look on somebody's face as they struggle for answers right up until the moment they realize it's all pointless anyway. Again Naruto stayed silent, calmly eyeing the man and his relaxed posture, so completely uncaring of the situation. So quiet him. That's not at all like the reports I've been getting. He looked up for a moment, a distant look in his eyes as if he was remembering a fond memory. Friendly, peaceful, always the last to advocate conflict yet the first to finish it, Ne. I had pictured you differently. He smirked slightly as he looked at Naruto up and down in a way that made the blonde feel like a piece of meat on display. Taller for one. Naruto kept his face blank, his eyes subtly moving around the room as he searched for any escape routes. He had heard about Yagura, many different stories, many different perspectives, all painting the same image. He rarely came out from Kirigakure, preferring to lead his troops from afar with a calculating mind, like pieces on a chessboard. However, when he did emerge he was like a completely different person. He would wade through battlefields, anybody who crossed his path like they were nothing but nuisances. The only time people had ever seen him become even remotely serious was a brief scuffle where May first faced off against him. People didn't tell him much about that fight, most didn't care to remember. Not even going to rise to that. How very disappointing. I've always hated one-sided conversations, it makes me feel like some two-bit monologuing villain, Ne. Naruto remained quiet, slowly twitching his hand up in hopes of catching the Mizukage off guard. Like he had told himself many times, he was confident in his own abilities, but he was by no means taking on the Mizukage, or any cage, sounded out of his reach. Oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Naruto's hand hesitated for a moment as a smirk twitched on Yagura's lips. Something bad might happen if you were to unleash one of your invisible blasts in such a tight space, Ne. With a simple hand motion from the diminutive cage, 10 shinobi suddenly dropped from the darkness of the ceiling, making Naruto's eyes widen in surprise at not seeing them before. Seeing this, Yagura's smirk turned into a full-blown grin, his eyes lighting up in almost sadistic pleasure. Ah, there it is. The confusion, the shock, the questions. ... He chuckled to himself again, taking on a barely sane expression. So many questions, Ne. His face became serious again, or at least his eyes did. He still managed to keep that confident and irritating smirk firmly plastered on his scarred face. Did you really think you were the only one with the ability to go unnoticed? The only one to be able to turn invisible? You probably counted on the fact I wouldn't be able to detect you, Ne. His chuckle came out lower that time, more menacing. Please boy, ever since the second Tsuchikage, people all over the nation scrambled to come up with techniques to rival his own, not to mention ways of countering it. It's almost a shame my predecessor SK him, I would have loved to known how he managed it. Either way I came up with my own way, what with Jiraiya of the Sannin so famous for his stealth, it wouldn't do for Konoha or anybody else interfering in my country. His voice was gleeful again, he obviously loved the sound of his own voice a little too much. Water's such an incredible thing, Ne. It's all around us, hanging in the air, in the ground, in the sky and in our bee. Did you know that around 6% of the air you're breathing, walking through, standing in, is water vapor? By pushing my chakra through these trace amounts of water, I can literally sense everything within a mile radius. Plants, people, rocks, it doesn't matter as long as they have physical form. Yagura grinned maliciously as his eyes returned to staring at Naruto. But I seem to be getting away from myself, Ne. Ah, that's right, I was just about to send a message to Terumi and her fleeting little rebellion. What better way to do that than to string up their little helper? Don't think I don't know that you're the one who irritated my forces over the last few months, you and those two little girls that follow you around like puppies. The manic gleam returned to the man's eyes as he saw Naruto narrow his eyes. Surprised, Ne? You really shouldn't be. I'm the Mizukage or Kirigakure no Sato, I am Mizu no Kuni, there is nothing I cannot see within the shores of my land. Naruto tried to catch the man off guard, quickly bringing his hand up in hopes of bringing down the roof on top of them. However, he faltered as Yagura made a single subtle gesture with his finger and two more Kiri Anbu dropped from the ceiling. He hesitated because carried between them was Shizuku, her head hung forward and her body limp. Shizuku. Yagura grinned at finally getting a reaction out of the blonde, motioning for the two Anbu to bring the girl over to him. The boy finally speaks. I was beginning to think you were too frightened to talk and that would have just been too boring, ne. Naruto was doing his best to control himself but seeing Shizuku's limp, almost lifeless body like that had his fist trembling. The only thing that held him back was the fact he could still see her sea rising and falling in shallow breaths. Interesting company you keep, ne. I thought for sure we had wiped out the Huzuki clan with Mangetsu, yet along comes little Shizuku here with her prodigious affinity for water ninjutsu and ability to perform what should have been a technique to S out with that traitorous swordsman. The young-looking man had grown slightly angry in his rant but quickly calmed himself down, putting a finger to his brow in amusement again. You want to know something interesting about the unique physiology of the Huzuki clan? Yagura idly looked at his hand, turning it back and forth as brief sparks of lighting began to dance between his fingers. While they are immune to almost any physical attack, be it blunt force trauma or even blades, they have an unusually low pain tolerance when it comes to electricity. I say unusual as during their technique they don't physically have nerves, yet even so. Without warning, the man suddenly grabbed Shizuku by the back of the L, channeling the lightning into her body with a manic, gleeful smile. They still feel the pain. Shizuku's head suddenly shot up, her eyes wide as she screamed in agony. Shizuku. Naruto was about to rush forward when Yagura suddenly stopped, letting Shizuku slump back to the floor, her body convulsing as blue sparks faded away over her body. What did I tell you about doing something brash? Somebody could get hurt, ne. Naruto stopped, his hands now both clenched into fists that trembled at his sides. His head was lowered slightly so that his messy hair fell about his forehead, shadowing his eyes. Let her go. The Mizukage raised an eyebrow in amusement as he passed his staff from one hand to the other in a way eerily reminiscent of the way Naruto would with his shakuju. What was that? I could have sworn I just heard a monk demanding something from a cage. He smirked cruelly as he reached down, picking Shizuku up at the back of her L. The girl was in too much pain to even struggle, she was just held there limply in the man's surprisingly strong grip. She couldn't even focus long enough to use the hydrification technique, her body was just too unresponsive. She screamed out again as another wave of electricity passed through her body, although this time when it stopped Yagura kept a hold of her. Let her go. Naruto took a step forward, making many of the Anbu in the room twitch their hands towards their kunai pouches. Again, Yagura only seemed amused, thoughtful even, before he quickly tossed the girl towards one of his men. The message was clear, if Naruto tried anything the man would not hesitate to K Shizuku. Oh, so I did hear you right, how odd, ne. He looked up, tapping his chin for a moment as he continued to smile down at the trembling monk. You know what, I'm anything if not a merciful man. How about a demonstration of just how outclassed you are here, how outclassed this pathetic little rebellion is? I'll even let you leave here if you win. As he spoke, a large grin spread over his features as he lifted his arms wide, almost mockingly. Naruto needed no further invitation as his hand shot up, the Mizukage's eyes already following the action and moving accordingly. Shinra Tensei. Adrenaline pumped through the blonde's body, slowing everything around him slightly. He had put enough force behind that attack to level a small building, certainly enough to incapacitate a man if it hit them directly. However, Yagura wasn't idle, his staff had already flashed forward, inscribing a wide circle in the air faster than most could blink. Suten, Mizukagami no Jutsu. The young-looking Kage's tone was almost lazy as he stood there, watching like everybody else as water suddenly congregated in that spot, forming into a perfectly flat, circular mirror. What happened next would have made most believe Naruto had done nothing at all, but with his eyes Naruto could see everything. A perfect replica of his technique emerged from the mirror, clashing with his own Shinra Tensei and cancelling it out completely. There wasn't even a breeze to show two insanely powerful jutsu had collided, it was simply nullified in its entirety. Now do you see, monk? Your every attack, your every move, copied down to the last detail and sent right back at you. It's useless, NE. Naruto just grimaced as he put both hands up, channeling an enormous amount of chakra into his hands and focusing it to the best of his ability. Shinra Tensei. This time there was no mistaking that Naruto had done something. In an instant a deep gorge was gouged from the earth, shredding through the concrete as powerful gravitational waves rent the earth. When the resulting smoke finally cleared, Naruto was shocked to see an identical trench meeting his, emerging from the mirror which was completely unscathed. The Mizukage appeared around the side, a playful smirk on his face as he twirled his staff absently. See it now, monk. I don't know how I could make it any clearer with a mirror right in front of you. Naruto just huffed once before crouching, his muscles tensing before he suddenly shot forward, actually surprising many of the Anbu that a boy as young as him could move so fast. Meanwhile the Mizukage yawned into his hand, harmlessly dispersing his technique as he twirled his staff. Naruto was inches away from striking the man with two pointed fingers crackling with electricity when his eyes widened in surprise. It happened so fast many would have missed it even if they didn't blink. One moment Yagura was lazily leaning against his staff, the next he had it held out in front of him. Naruto sailed back, skidding across the ground for a moment before rolling to a stop and coughing violently. Tentatively he got to his feet, clutching his sea where he was sure a large bruise would be forming. He hadn't even seen Yagura move yet he had struck him almost effortlessly. The worst part was Naruto somehow knew he was holding back on that blow. Is that all? You know I was hoping for a lot more from you. He looked around whimsically, once again twirling his staff as if he hadn't a care in the world. Then again, I guess there's no sand in here for you to use, NE. He smirked as Naruto's hands clenched again but frowned as a grim smile made its way onto the blonde's face. Wrong. Suddenly the backs of his hands glowed as two seals suddenly revealed themselves. Moments later copious amounts of sand suddenly poured out, surrounding Naruto protectively. It wasn't as much as he would like but he had to make do with what little he could seal. It was difficult to seal chakra-imbued substances, especially something like his sand. Yagura actually raised an eyebrow for a moment before chuckling to himself. Now that's a little more like it, but unfortunately for you, not enough. He suddenly crouched down, placing two fingers on the floor with a smirk. Sangoshu. Before Naruto could react, the ground around Yagura suddenly changed. Random growths of strange red material suddenly appeared, spreading out at an alarming rate. As it approached, Naruto suddenly recognized it as coral, except it was growing as if it were alive. In mere moments he was surrounded by it. He sent out his sand to destroy it, but to his horror as soon as a single grain touched the coral it was simply engulfed by it. It spread so fast that his sand didn't stand a chance. Soon it was all gone, either surrounded by or simply absorbed into the red substance. Naruto quickly jumped up and away from it before it could reach him and ensnare him too, landing in a clear spot. When he turned, Yagura raised his hand off the ground and the coral simply crumbled away as if it had never been there, taking the sand with it. His attention was brought back to the Mizukage as he tapped his staff on the ground once. Well, now I'm bored. It was amusing for a moment but ultimately it served its purpose. Do you now see what you face? Do you now see why it is futile to struggle against me? He smirked, absently tapping his chin with the end of his staff. I had wanted to send a message to the rebellion and have you be the one to send it, but honestly you're a little too dangerous to keep alive, NE. The man sighed theatrically but his cruel eyes showed no regrets. Well, I'll find another way. My men are closing in on your little green-haired friend on the other end of the building. Maybe she could do it in your stead. He looked up, staring into the distance in a contemplative manner before shrugging carelessly. In any case, you two are now unnecessary. With a simple gesture from the man's hand, Naruto was forced to watch in horror as the Anbu holding Shizuku suddenly brought his kunai back. Naruto's eyes focused intently as another small drop of crimson splashed out on the floor, creating a small circular stain. It was joined by another, then another, before a veritable deluge of red liquid fell from Shizuku's wound. He ignored everything else, his breathing, the sound of the Anbu wiping off the BK, even the sound Yagura made as he passed his staff from one hand to the other. His focus was entirely on Shizuku and the slowly growing patch of scarlet around the tear in her kimono top. You see, monk, everybody in the world has a weakness as long as they make foolish attachments to others. As a Kage, you come to understand that to best rule your people, your forces, you must discard these petty feelings. I believe that is what you monks are taught, is it not? To discard feeling and look objectively at the world in order to retain enlightenment, ne. Yagura gazed at the stunned blonde coolie, raising a disinterested eyebrow at his lack of response. The pale-haired man simply sighed as he turned, shrugging rather nonchalantly as he made a deft motion with his hand. Shizuku's body was thrown forward unceremoniously, rolling across the ground and leaving a small trail of her bee in random patches where she bounced, each time letting out another pained cry. Naruto was almost immediately at her side. None of the Anbu moved, awaiting orders from Yagura, but a few hands still twitched towards their respective weapon pouches. Naruto gently rolled Shizuku over, grimacing when the girl shuddered in pain and coughed up B, staining her normally pale chin an ugly red. I'm sorry, Naruto. The blonde's hand trembled when he heard her weak voice. Don't talk, I can still help, I can get you somewhere to help. The girl's body was racked with shudders again as her head tilted up in another painful cough, B flecking her now dirtied clothes. Naruto. The blonde grabbed one of her hands in his own, squeezing it in what he hoped was a comforting manner. Please don't talk, you need to save your energy, right? That's what you're supposed to do in these situations, right? The blonde couldn't help but notice his voice now had a faintly hysterical edge as one trembling hand moved over Shizuku's body, trying to do something to stop the bee. When he pressed on the wound though, Shizuku's eyes closed in agonizing pain. It did nothing anyway, too much bee leaked between his fingers. Naruto, please. The boy just grabbed her hand again, helpless eyes darting around madly looking, searching for something, anything he could do to stop this. He didn't know medical ninjutsu, first aid would do nothing for something this severe. He felt so utterly and completely useless as he watched the girl he cared about so much be out right before his eyes. Come on, Shizuku, stop with that voice, all right. A weak smile made its way onto Naruto's face as he held the girl's hand a little higher, squeezing it gently with that same hysterical tone in his voice. You're acting like you're going to S or something. He chuckled shakily as Shizuku's eyelids began to slowly droop, fluttering back up with every jolt of pain coursing through her veins. Slowly she felt her body become numb, the pain ebbing away in favor of a strange detachment, as if her body was no longer hers and she was just a spectator. Naruto. His lips quivered slightly as she struggled with the words, already feeling the edges of her vision grow dark. All she could see were the two quivering orbs of Naruto's rippled eyes looking down at her with almost frantic worry, a few strands of blonde hair falling across them. He seemed to perk up slightly with her voice, giving a hand another pointless but comforting squeeze. Unfortunately, she could no longer feel the limp hand held in his grasp. Please stop crying. Her voice choked up at the end as more specks of red found their way onto her otherwise pale lips. Naruto just blinked, noticing for the first time the few drops of clear liquid on Shizuku's cheeks, one of them lazily rolling down the curvature of her face. He lifted a still shaking hand up to his eyes and wiped at them, staring down with what appeared to be shock at the warm tears on the end of his finger. His eyes widened when Shizuku raised a shaking but still controlled hand up to his cheek, rubbing his whisker marks once before wiping him of the stains his tears had made. A faint, fleeting smile twitched at the corners of her mouth as a brief spark re-entered her eyes in that moment. There, that's better. It didn't last for long as her body was once again racked with painful coughs that had her head swimming from the pain. The darkness around her vision grew and she began to lose sight of Naruto's face as the image grew fuzzy. With her last ounce of strength, Shizuku forced another brief smile onto her face as her eyes closed. They just felt too heavy to keep open and right now she was so very tired. Naruto, thank you. And with that Shizuku's shallow breathing stopped entirely, her fluttering heartbeat coming to a slow, peaceful stop as her head fell to one side. Naruto became pale as he knelt there, hands covered in his friend's bee grasping at her cooling shoulders. Shush, Shizuku. He felt his breath begin to quicken as Shizuku didn't answer, her body stayed limp, unmoving, lifeless. Shizuku. His grip on her shoulders tightened slightly as he gently shook her, as if she was only asleep and she simply needed to wake up. Shizuku. He felt warm tears prickling at the edges of his vision again but sniffed them back. She didn't want him to cry so he wouldn't. Come on, Shizuku, you have to wake up. We still have things to do, don't we? A pained smile was forced across his lips as he continued to lightly shake the girl by her shoulders. Come on, we were going to try and find your family, remember? He choked up a little as he literally felt the girl's warmth leak out in his hands. We still had stuff to do right, like your techniques. His heart rate rose quickly as his smile turned into a pained frown. He lifted Shizuku's body up and hugged her against him, uncaring of the bee now staining his robes. His hands were covered in it anyway. We were going to go to sooner and make it rain. His voice was little more than a hoarse whisper at this point, tears freely flowing down his cheeks as he just held the girl there. He wasn't sure how long he stayed there with her cold body pressed up against his, her limp head resting on his shoulder as he sobbed. It was probably only a few seconds, but it felt like a lot longer. Gently and slowly he lowered her body back down to the floor, wiping off the last of his tears and leaving red smudges across his cheeks carelessly. With shaking legs he stood up, his eyes still firmly locked on his friend's still, unmoving body. Yagura listened to all of this with a decidedly bored expression, absently staring at one of his fingers. He had granted the boy the girl's dying words on a whim, to see if anything interesting happened, and he was rather disappointed. Usually it excited him to see the light leaving his victim's eyes, but this time he just felt indifferent. He felt as though he had dragged this out a little too long and wanted to get back to his nice cozy office. Absently he made another gesture with the hand he wasn't looking at. Deal with him, I've lost interest in this. He didn't bother turning back to look when all of his Anbu drew out as many kunai as they could. He heard the faint whistle as the wall of steel flew forward through the air, none of them even remotely off course. He only had the best in Anbu after all. He also noted with some amusement that even the Anbu he still had stationed in the shadows of the ceiling heeded his signal, adding to the barrage of flying weapons bearing down on the young monk. However, his ears twitched slightly when they weren't rewarded with the satisfying sound of metal hitting flesh. Instead, all he got was the idle clatter of K hitting the floor, as if a ninja had simply upturned his pouch and emptied it onto the ground. When he turned, he saw Naruto still standing there, not a mark marring his body. His hand was raised up, palm flat towards them, while his hair fell forward, shadowing his eyes. Around him, like a ring of steel, was a small armory of K, not a single one anywhere closer than 2 meters to his body. Still fighting, even now. I thought you had realized the futility of such pointless actions, Ne. Naruto didn't say anything, his head remained down and his gaze on Shizuku's lifeless body. Slowly his hand lowered, coming to a stop at his side in a tightly clenched fist. B dripped from between his fingers and Yagura couldn't tell if it was from the girl or his own from his fingernails biting into his palm. The Mizukage just sighed lazily, leaning against his staff without a care as he tapped his chin thoughtfully, wondering how to make this more interesting. He didn't have to though, as he and the Anbu watched on a malevolent aura began to spread through the room. The winds around Naruto seemed to pick up slightly even as his body remained perfectly still, making his robes flutter slightly. Yagura was unimpressed, the level of K intent was barely even noticeable to him and the Anbu weren't much worse off. However, it quickly began to pick up. The winds that only seemed to affect the young monk grew in their intensity, making his hair fly about, still somehow managing to shadow his eyes through it all. Gradually the malicious aura permeating the air began to weigh down on the men in the room like an invisible pressure. Soon they realized it wasn't just that, there really was an actual pressure weighing down on their shoulders, making their B feel heavy and sluggish. Yagura still seemed unaffected, but he at least had noticed the added weight on his body. Only a few of them noticed as Naruto's hands clenched even harder, and with every muscle contraction the pressure on him increased. It was only a few seconds before the first of them cracked, an Anbu on the ceiling that was struggling for breath dropping to the ground. Others soon followed, dropping down to their knees as they could barely stand to hold up their own weight, suddenly feeling as though they had enormous iron chains pulling down on their B. Through it all Yagura stayed standing, the only noticeable change being his eyes narrowing slightly and his teeth gritting in mild annoyance. The winds around Naruto were now so strong that a faint cloud of dust had begun to circle him steadily, his hair lifted up into the air that had begun to shimmer around him. Yagura recognized what was happening, and he could honestly say he was surprised. He had seen this many times before, but usually because he was at the center of it all. Vile red chakra began leaking from Naruto's skin, so concentrated it was actually visible, and started to form a shroud. It bubbled menacingly, as if it was alive and just waiting to lash out at anything and everything that came near. Ever so slightly Naruto hunched over as the raw, potent chakra continued to stream out of his body. A Jinchuriki. Those pesky rebels are better at hiding their secrets than I give them credit for, ne. Yagura lazily rolled his shoulders, spinning his staff once only to s it down in front of him. I hope you know that won't save you. A brat like you could never have mastered your forms. The young-looking Mizukage gave a vicious grin that went unnoticed by the blonde at the other end of the room. I on the other hand have no such restrictions, ne. Upon not receiving an answer, the cage's lips twitched slightly. He hated to be ignored, especially by somebody beneath him. It's very rude to ignore your superiors, ne. The only response he got was the cloak bubbling more as three thick and swaying tails of chakra emerged from the base of Naruto's spine. At the same time, the cloak around his feet widened into a shape more reminiscent of paws, while on his head two long ears of chakra sprouted from the shroud. Yagura just smirked. The bubbles in the cloak showed the boy had no control whatsoever, just as to the Bijuu's emotions, in this case most likely rage. The strange thing was that wasn't the only thing happening. What the Mizukage had first believed to be dust billowing around the boy's feet actually revealed itself to be sand as it grew thicker around him. It would twitch upwards at random but never strayed more than 2 meters from the blonde, just circling him almost protectively. Not only that, the area of the cloak surrounding his arms was different, taking on a more purplish hue and appeared to be flaming more than bubbling like the rest. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped. Naruto's eyes snapped open, and in that moment the tails and various other parts of the shroud that made him appear fox-like vanished. However, the cloak disturbingly remained, no longer undefined and bubbling, now crisp and sharp around his body like a second skin of chakra. Slowly and deliberately the monk's head turned, allowing his deep purple eyes to lock with Yagura's more confused pink ones. You. His voice was almost a whisper, barely audible, yet there was no mistaking that it was his own. There was no hint of any other influence guiding him as he took a step forward. Yagura just blinked in surprise. What he was seeing should be impossible. Manifesting a full cloak without the tails and no physical change to his body was unheard of. It was like the chakra wasn't a Bijuu's, but his to control as he saw fit. As his foot hit the ground, it created a small crater from the sheer pressure of the energy surrounding Naruto. Yagura snarled lightly. He hated being misinformed and caught off guard like this. It showed weakness, and he was anything but weak. In an instant he was surrounded by a similar aura of dark red chakra, 3 long tails like those belonging to a shrimp waving almost excitedly behind him. Even his staff was encased by the energy, making the flower wither slightly under the corrosive shroud. Unlike Naruto, his body changed slightly. His eyes became red and ringed with a single golden band around the pupil. You're punching above your weight class, boy. The aura in the air became even more oppressive with the second Jinchuriki releasing his inner chakra. However, where Yagura's was controlled but filled with an innate rage, Naruto simply felt cold and powerful. The blonde never stopped walking forward, with each step creating another small crater as the ground beneath him splintered. As he got closer, the pressure pushing down on the Anbu increased. All of them were pressed flat to the floor by now. Many of them began to whimper in pain despite their training, feeling their ribcages be slowly crushed as if some enormous weight had been placed on their sea. You should stop now, boy, before I force you, ne. Naruto's features nearly twisted into an almost animalistic snarl, however his eyes never strayed from Yagura's. The cage would never admit it, but he was incredibly unnerved by those eyes, so full of cold, unbridled fury, glowing with the chakra coursing through the young blonde's body. Yagura just let out a deep growl from somewhere in the back of his tea and charged forward, blasting a few tiles back from the speed he moved. There was an explosion of dust and debris as the two met, Yagura with his staff raised to strike and Naruto, doing nothing. It took a few moments for the air to clear, but when it did, the few Anbu that could successfully lift their heads or were lucky enough to be looking in the right direction could only widen their eyes behind their masks. Naruto simply stood there in a large crater, the sand still whipping around him angrily. Yagura was about a foot of the ground, held up with Naruto's hand firmly around his tea. The staff lay on the ground, knocked from his hands faster than the cage could comprehend before he was seized painfully. Even through the protective cloak of the Sanbi's chakra he could feel that slightly flaming purple hand around his tea, tightening slowly. When he looked down he saw Naruto hadn't changed. His face was still twisted into a snarl and his eyes were just as cold. However, there was something there now, a glint of a feeling Yagura hadn't ever seen when fighting somebody before, satisfaction. Faster than an eye could even blink, Naruto pulled back his arm that held the shocked Cage in its grasp and launched the man forward. The Biju-cloaked Mizukage flew backwards, propelled by incredible force through the ceiling of the room, out through the ground above him. Naruto cast a cold, impassive look around the room, his eyes lingering on Shizuku's body for a split second as his gaze softened before it re-hardened at the Anbu. He walked back to Shizuku's body, picking it up under one arm, not even stopping to marvel at how impossibly light she felt. He looked up, pointing his closed fist to the hole Yagura's body had sailed through before splaying his hand. Instantly the roof of the room was blown back. Naruto didn't even have to speak, his chakra simply molded instinctively, sending gravitational forces rippling through the room with more power than he had ever used before. He jumped up with a powerful burst of chakra, hovering for a moment over the ground before touching the wet grass above. Around him the ground fell apart, crushing everything in the room. A part of him realized those Anbu were still down there, another part just didn't care. With gentleness that most wouldn't think possible with him enshrouded in such foul and potent chakra, Naruto lay Shizuku down on the ground. He soon turned his attention back to the Mizukage who just then emerged from the tree line, looking rightfully irritated. Naruto on the other hand gazed with a cool rage burning just beneath his purple orbs, directed entirely at the gray-haired man. I'll admit you surprised me with that, boy. I had not expected you to be so fast. Do not think I will underestimate you again. Naruto remained where he was, eyes remaining locked on Yagura as a cool rain poured from the sky, evaporating instantly when it met the two Jinchuriki's cloaks. The young-looking Cage suddenly hunched over as the oppressive and overwhelming chakra around his body suddenly contracted. The skin on his body began to peel away in a grotesque manner, giving way to a black and red seething mass of pure unrestrained chakra. Soon all that remained was a small, humanoid figure with three shrimp-like tails and a spiky tortoise-esque shell made of the same almost liquid chakra. Naruto didn't even blink, he just slowly walked forward, his feet still creating craters with each step. The miniature Sanbi suddenly raised its head back, tails coming forward and hovering over the mouth of the beast. Little orbs of blue and red chakra burst out of its body all over, floating for a moment before suddenly rushing back in, compressing into a large black ball. The chakra beast wavered for a moment, the tails struggling under the weight of the compressed chakra that looked like it was trying to burst outwards despite its perfectly spherical shape. Undeterred, Naruto stalked forward, not even making a motion to defend himself as the mini Sanbi finally gained control over its attack, suddenly launching the Bijudama forward. Naruto's lips merely twitched as the enormously dangerous attack rocketed forward. He stopped, taking a deep breath while all the while maintaining eye contact with the red humanoid mass that was Yagura. Before the Bijudama could hit, four long projections of chakra suddenly emerged from Naruto's cloak, acting similarly to when Yagura had created the sphere and catching it with their tips. A huge shockwave blasted back the nearby trees as the figurative immovable object and unstoppable force met before a moment of stillness settled over the clearing. Almost immediate, the large black sphere shrank, not compressing but simply dwindling away as Naruto completely absorbed the powerful attack. As soon as it was gone, the long tail-like projections shrank back into the cloak and Naruto resumed walking forward. The version 2 Yagura's large white eyes widened in surprise and, unwittingly, fear as the chakra-cloaked monk moved towards him. Banshu Tenon. Before Yagura could do anything, he was flying through the air towards the blonde outstretched hand. Once again the normally unstoppable Cage found his L tightly in Naruto's grip as his hand slowly began to squeeze. Much to the Jinchuriki's horror, where his cloak met Naruto's hand, it began to be away, revealing his own skin beneath. He could literally feel both his own and the Sanbi's chakra get absorbed into the younger boy, something that by all accounts should have killed him due to the Biju chakra's corrosive and poisonous properties. Suddenly all three of his briny tails jabbed forward, indenting to skewer the boy that dare hold him, a Cage, in such a manner. However, they were immediately halted by the sand still circling his feet, acting as if by its own volition. For the very first time since Yagura had become the Yondai Mizukage, as he was held there by a boy less than a third his age, he felt true, unrequited fear in his heart. Suddenly a snarl appeared on his strange red face as his struggles renewed with vigor. It's not over yet, monk. An explosion rocked through the clearing that even managed to blast Naruto back, leaving him to skid along the ground, leaving two long trenches where his feet ripped through the earth. When he lowered his arms from shielding his eyes, he stared up with that same fury at the enormous visage of the mighty Sanbi no Kyodai itself, which only stared back with one furious eye. It released an almighty encompassing roar that could be heard for miles around that Naruto didn't even flinch at. Slowly, languidly even, the chakra-shrouded blonde began to raise himself up into the air until he was above even the mighty Biju. He stared down at the beast with cold, fury-filled eyes that had the beast's own widen in shock before he raised a single arm. Shinra Tensei. Fu hadn't finished dealing with the Kirigakure shinobi that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere when the earth-shaking blast rocked the building. All around him the cracks in the walls grew as dust rained from the ceiling. Everybody had the same thought of self-preservation as they rushed from the building, finding the nearest exit and dashing out into the rainy night. As they did, a deafening roar echoed out that filled all of the shinobi with an innate, terrifying feeling as they looked towards the source with horror. Fu didn't waste time like that. She knew that wherever that roar came from, Naruto was bound to be close by. She jumped up onto the top of the building and dashed across even as the roof began to collapse around her. She had to stop a moment as a massive shockwave of air and dust suddenly blasted past her, forcing her to grip the roof with chakra before carrying on when it finally cleared. She leapt off at the other end, sprinting at full speed towards where she could feel the oppressive power of an unleashed Jinchuriki up ahead. Fu didn't know if that meant Naruto was fighting a Jinchuriki or he had resorted to his own Bijuu's power. Either way it was bad, and Fu knew she had to do something to help. After all, there were few better to suppress a Jinchuriki than with another Jinchuriki. Finally she emerged into a large clearing that looked recently made. The trees around the edge were all violently bent back, most were broken and shattered into splinters. In the epicenter of the massive clearing was an equally large crater, and at the center of that was an unbelievable sight. Naruto was holding a humanoid creature Fu knew to be a version 2 Jinchuriki forms, and based on the tails she knew it had to be the Sanbi container, Yagura. She sighed in relief when she saw Naruto didn't even look remotely injured, a strange tailless cloak surrounding him as his eyes bored into Yagura's. As she continued to watch, the red layer bled away. At that moment something else caught her eye, as the edge of the enormous crater was a limp, lifeless body that had Fu's eyes widening in surprise and shock. Yagura began to feel his vision go fuzzy as the blonde monk holding him up by his tea continued to steal all of his chakra. Both his and the Sanbi's. He could only look into the boy's purple rippled eyes, chuckling to himself inside as he thought about the irony of being killed by a bloodline user, one with the most powerful dojutsu ever known no less. He was surprised though when, as he felt the last of his tenant's chakra be absorbed, he saw something change in the monk's eyes. For a brief instant, almost unnoticeable if he hadn't been looking directly at him, 3 tomo appeared in the boy's eyes. 2 circled the outermost ring in the eye, forming 2/3 of a triangle between them, while the last was on its own in the center ring, the small tail of the Magatama flicking away from the pupil. As he watched, a 4th tomo materialized in the outermost ring, completing the triangle before all 4 faded away. A choking laugh escaped his tea that only served to have the blonde tighten his grip even further. See him off. What now, monk? Will you K me? But that's breaking your moral code, NE. He managed a grim smile as Naruto continued to glare at him with those legendary eyes that narrowed. You deserve worse than death for everything you've done. The young-looking Kage coughed, already feeling his life slipping away from the forced removal of his Biju. No matter what happened he was going to S. Strangely, he felt no fear, only a strange, almost uplifting freedom. It would have sent him into a fit of hysterical laughter if his windpipe wasn't currently being crushed in the boy's hand. Maybe, maybe not, but are you going to be my E? You don't have it in you. We both know it. Naruto looked away at that and Yagura felt the boy's hand tremble slightly. He managed one last grin at his supposed last victory that quickly on his face as the blonde's gaze snapped back round. Human path. Time froze for Yagura as a cold chill swept through his body, like a million tiny hooks were grabbing at every fiber of his body. It burned like he had been buried in ice. Then, just as suddenly, it stopped with a horrific ripping sound. There was a moment of peace as he felt free, like a stray cloud floating on the breeze, then, nothing. That was for Shizuku. Naruto panted slightly as the cloak of chakra around his body slowly dissipated. He still held Yagura's body in one hand, now limp. He dropped it to the floor coldly just as he felt another presence at his side. Fu looked down at the body of the Yondai Mizukage with a mixture of contempt and confusion. She wasn't quite sure how to feel in this situation. However, she felt there was a more pressing matter as she placed a hand on Naruto's shoulder. Naruto, the blonde just walked away without a word, leaving the mint-haired Jinchuriki to simply blink. She turned to see him stalk over to Shizuku's body, dropping to his knees beside her and just sitting there. After a moment or two she walked over and joined him, both just sitting in the silence of the clearing, the bee of their best friend and enemy both lying around them. The atmosphere in the command tent was rather light for once. Despite the rebellion being slowly pushed back, the conversation seemed to have shifted onto a more jovial topic. May was taking it all in with a smile as she sat back on her seat, a small smile on her face. This was what she fought for, to see her people smiling and happy, joking despite the rough times. She sighed happily as something Chojuro said managed to set Ao off on one of his rants. Really, back in my day you would not only be ineligible for such things, but you would be actively denied from taking part. Really, I didn't think I had become too old that the youth today would know nothing of the traditional ways. There was a brief silence as May's eye twitched violently, a dark aura appearing around her body. Ineligible, denied, too old. She slowly got to her feet, however before she could give Ao his usual death threat they all heard some kind of commotion outside the tent. Blinking in surprise, Ao immediately activated the Byakugan beneath his eye patch. However, what he saw just had him stood stock still, gulping like a fish thrown onto the shore. A minute later they heard a smaller but closer commotion just outside the tent. A minute later, when the outside had settled into an eerie calm, a figure ducked in under the flaps. May sighed internally when she saw it was just Naruto. She was a little miffed that he had simply walked in unannounced, though, as the guards were there to stop people doing that. However, she immediately noticed something was wrong when Naruto lacked the usual serene smile he always wore. In fact, his face was completely devoid of any warmth. It was that moment she noticed the blonde was dragging something behind him. Correction, somebody. A moment later the entire command tent was staring at the lifeless body of the Yondai Mizukage as Naruto carelessly tossed his limp form into their midst. A moment later he walked straight back out again without a word, leaving everybody in shocked silence. That will be all for this video. Be sure to like, subscribe, share, and comment down below for more videos. Goodbye.